investigative report on the state of shelters in South Africa. And the investigation was prompted by the CGE's proposal for law reform in 2013. And just to give some context to this before we go there, several shelters in all 9 provinces were randomly sampled in an endeavour to get a clearer state of shelters in South Africa. Let's listen in.
To deal with the statement on the shelter report. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to this briefing. The purpose of the briefing, as earlier indicated by Marisa, is to convey the outcomes of a systemic investigation that the Commission for Gender Equality undertook to assess the state of the shelter. The shelters, not just one shelter, but quite a number of shelters in provinces. The shelters that are actually accommodating victims or survivors of gender-based violence, but in particular those that are coming out of out as survivors of gender-based violence and members of lesbian, gays, bisexual, transgender, and intersex communities. This form of investigation did not happen in a vacuum, but it was necessitated by the fact that the Commission has its own mandate, and it's mandated not only by what we see in South Africa, but by instruments that are of regional as well as international nature. And one of these instruments is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or commonly known as CEDAW. Section 24B of CEDAW compels the Commission to ensure that the legislation intended to curb family violence and abuse, gender-based violence, rape, and sexual assault gives adequate protection to women. This particular state obligation has now become important in light of the current state of GBV in South Africa. In other words, it has become essential to assess the conditions of GBV in South Africa. Let me repeat that. In other words, it has become important in light of the current state of GBV in South Africa. I think I'm repeating myself. In other words, it has become essential to assess the conditions of the shelters amidst the high levels of GBV as well as femicide in South Africa. In line with the CGE Act, Section 11(1)(e), which actually states that such an assessment may happen through an investigation, the outcomes thereof ought to be in the public interest. Apart from the CEDAW and the accompanying policy and legislation on the protection of gender equality, it is important to understand the policy intent of the state in providing adequate measures to meet our obligations in relation to Section 24 of CEDAW. It is in this instance that I draw your attention to a salient policy directive which came from the State of the Nation Address of 2018 regarding the protection of victims of gender-based violence. In the SONA 2018, the President of the Republic of South Africa, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, stated that, and I quote, "Political and community leadership must support and champion the cause of eradicating gender-based violence and femicide." I close quote. And he went on to further state that should be one, I open quote, adequate resourcing of Thuthuzela care centers, sexual offences courts, and shelters that respond to the needs of all people, including people with disabilities and LGBTIQA persons. I close quote. The interest of the Commission in relation to the protection of victims of gender-based violence through the provision of adequate shelters spans as far back as 2013, when the Commission for Gender Equality submitted a proposal of law for law reform on the same subject matter in order to improve the conditions and assess the conditions of the shelters in South Africa. The key position of the Commission still stands in that we still believe that the increased access and improvement of the conditions of Thuthuzela care centers will further reduce the impact of gender-based violence and survivors from an economic as well as social perspective. It is in this instance that we also believe that shelters serve as mechanisms for survivors to escape the cycle of abuse and avoid the further harm. As we stated our position in 2013, we also raised an issue pertaining to the funding of these shelters. This was raised with the view that costs of managing shelters should be factored into various departments of government, and this should be done as part of institutionalizing gender-based violence and budgeting initiatives in those institutions. Having given this background, it is also important for me to state that the Commission received numerous complaints from victims of gender-based violence who were provided protection by these shelters that we're talking about today. Complainants in this regard complained about lack of counseling at the shelters, secondary victimization and abuse, as well as general conditions of the shelters. This further compelled the Commission to look at the state of the shelters with reference to issues of human interest, in other words, with the view that some residents of these shelters remain unsatisfied with the state of affairs. With all the above factors I have mentioned thus far, the Commission conducted an investigation in all 9 provinces from 2018 to 2019 financial year. The following information was analyzed for the purpose for this investigation. The first one being the shelter information status and staffing, the shelter capacity and accommodation criteria, period of stay and survivor readiness to exit the shelters, shelter funding and resources, shelter service package offer, shelter service basket, record keeping and ethics confidentiality, record keeping and ethics confidentiality, but also shelter management, staffing and supervision, nature of relationship with the South African Police Service, safety and security measures, substance abuse and rehabilitation, and lastly, the general challenges experienced by other people who are admitted in these shelters, like those living with disabilities and the LGBTIQ persons. Apart from what I have stated, we also requested the Department of Social Development to provide us with the following information as part of our investigation. The first information that we asked from the department was the budget allocation for the shelters, measures and programs to support these shelters, efforts to rectify the lacuna in the Domestic Violence Act, and outline and evidence of the Department of Social Development's development quality assurance, information on the complaints mechanism for residents of shelters, and lastly, mechanisms to prevent shelter unfairly discrimination against people living with disability and those LGBTIQA community. The findings of this investigation unveiled the following. We recognize that there was quite a lack of adequate funding for shelters. There was late payment of tranches and lack of cooperation, tranches from government going to shelters. In some shelters, the buildings and facility infrastructure and security poses a problem or a threat. There was lack of transition, which is in the form of housing or second stage housing, which is sometimes called green housing. There was lack of standardized salaries amongst the same occupation categories, including bettering of prerequisites for certain roles within the shelter itself. There was also lack of compliance to policies and standards, practices, policies, skills development, as well as complaint mechanisms with specific reference to the therapeutic methods that were used, the skills development approach, the early childhood development programs that the shelters could offer, the minimum and maximum periods of stay by the survivors of violence, GBV, and mechanisms used when a survivor requests a longer stay, including assessment and process to evaluate the request. Lastly, complaint mechanism at a shelter level. And we also realized that there was a general failure or neglect by Department of Social Development to ensure proper policies and implementation thereof including inconsistent funding methods. The survivors themselves struggle to adapt to normal living conditions after they have been discharged from the shelter. There was also lack of mainstreaming of international instruments, not only international but also regional instruments with gender equality provisions into the existing and proposed legislations relating to service rendered by the shelters. There was also inadequate DSD budgeting methods in the allocation of resources to shelters. There were no standardized approach to accommodate and assist survivors of the LGBTIQA communities or persons, and the rest, including other diverse sexual orientation and gender identifies or gender non-conforming persons. Based on the outcomes of our investigation, it's evident that there are deep-rooted systemic challenges which need adequate attention by the state or by the state institutions who bear the responsibility to make provisions for the protection of survivors of gender-based violence, and these to be addressed at the highest level of institutions that are expected to offer services to survivors of gender-based violence. In light of the above outcome of our systemic investigation, it's highly plausible that we may be in breach of the provision of Section 24 of CEDAW, but more importantly, the findings have a bearing on the following domestic legislation and policies. First of all, you know that we have the Constitution, and under the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, 108 of 1996, we have under Section 9 the rights of equality, and if we go to Section 10, there is a right to dignity. Section 12 talks about the rights to freedom and security of persons, and Section 13 refers to rights to privacy, and Section 26 of the Constitution talks about the rights to adequate housing, and last but not least, the limitation of rights under Section 26. Other forms of legislations that may be breached are as follows. The promotion of equality and prevention of unfair discrimination, 4 of 2000, which is called in short PEPUDA. The Domestic Violence Act, 116 of 1998. The Children's Act, 38 of 2005. And the last one is the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking of Persons Act 7 of 2013. Accordingly, the Commission for Gender Equality recommended the following. The Commission calls a public investigative hearing within the 2019-2020 period, wherein all head of departments within the 9 provinces, Department of DSD, will be called for these hearings. The Director General of the National Department of Social Development will be called for a hearing. The DG of the National Department of Human Settlement are called to fully account before the Commission and respond to questions regarding how shelters are allocated resources and any other aspect regarding the functioning and coordination of shelters, including the need for transitional housing. It is anticipated that the public investigative hearings will lead to further supplementary recommendations report, which will look into the matters regarding or concerning policy as well as practice in the shelter or in sheltering the survivors of gender-based violence. The late payment of tranches severely undermines the functioning of the shelters. In turn, the Commission of Gender Equality recommends that urgent action on the part of the Department of Social Development is taken to instill safeguards within its contract management systems, and wherein it provides clear pre-warning or pre-warning of required payments, and in turn accountability of those officials responsible for effecting these payments who do not or who do so late. The Department of Social Development is afforded the ambit to devise its own safeguard, albeit it must be effective and able to be rolled out throughout the 9 provinces. The safeguard, including time frames for rollout to the 9 provinces, must be provided to the Commission within a period of 3 months of release of the report. The Department of Social Development should finalize its policy regarding the gender-based violence prevention program for LGBTQIA community or persons within a period of 6 months from the date of the release of the report, including clear directives to shelters to comply and not unfairly disseminate or discriminate against people living with disability and LGBTIA plus persons. And this should include a clear communicated complaints process for survivors to report any discriminatory action on the part of shelters. The Department of Social Development, after consulting key stakeholders, to provide the Commission with the following. 1, a standardized policy detailing the manner and criteria to fulfill when survivors wish to apply for extensions at a shelter. This should also include a costing analysis or cost-benefit analysis where the cost of extensions are forecast and budgeted for, and a clear complaints mechanisms for survivors to appeal any negative decision. The second one, a standardized policy detailing the monitoring of survivors after exiting the shelters, including clear indicators to determine if the survivors are adjusting favorably in the outside world. The 2 policies, as part of recommendation 4.1 and 4.2, must be provided to the Commission within a period of 6 months after the release of the investigation report. Lastly, the Department of Social Development, in consultation with key stakeholders, should actually give us information around standardized salaries as well as stipends that are provided or given to persons employed by the shelters, including detailing criteria for such. Such standardized or standardization must be taken into account during the budgeting process and allocation of funds to the shelters. Lastly, detail and set the educational requirements and care skills needed for the requisite job roles in shelters. With all of this, I just want to say to you that the report is available after this, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Acting Chairperson. Before we go to the question and answer session, can I just highlight that the Twitter handle or Twitter feed, I don't know what you call it properly. Hashtag CGE Shelter Report. Please use that as when you tweet. Yes. Then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Muleko, who will deal with the facilitation of question and answers.
Thank you, Marissa. Okay, hashtag CGE Shelter Report. Ne? Hashtag CGE Shelter Report. Thank you so much. Small caps. It's immaterial. But thank you so much to everyone for joining us. What we're going to do now is field your questions, queries, clarity-seeking questions. Together with myself and the team, we will respond accordingly. And what I would like to ask is, I'll take several rounds. Let's go for a first round. Introduce yourself, where you're from again. We didn't catch everyone at the first instance, but also some people did arrive a little bit into the session already. So we'll take first 5 questions, and then we will go for a second round until such time as we feel we have exhausted the time here. Thank you very much. Can I go for the first round, please? Just a round of hands. 1. I'll take all the questions at one go. Next hand. Yourself? You had your hand up? So we only have one question. Okay?
Okay.
We'll take yours.
Nico Gijs from Times Live. So in terms of the report itself, I mean, you mentioned that you received complaints. So can you maybe sort of paint a picture of the complainants, what their situation was, what happened to them because of structural inefficiencies? Number one. Number two, how bad is the situation in shelters at the moment? And this investigation, was it the first of its kind into shelters in South Africa, or were there previous investigations, and was there improvement from that? Yeah.
Okay. Let me help you with the first question, and then the second part is how bad, and the historical reference. Okay, just to refer you to the manual which you'll get. The first complainant alleged that whilst residing at Ikaletemba, the social worker from the onset was only interested in her exit plans and showed little interest in providing her with the necessary counselling services. It was also alleged further that she was provided with limited transport to attend the psychologist, I suspect the psychologist sessions. This resulted in her not attending adequate counselling sessions as per the contract with Ikaletemba. It was further alleged that her social worker did not uphold confidentiality during consultations, as she permitted open consultations in the presence of other persons. That's the first. It was alleged that there was a predetermined decision not to extend her stay, notwithstanding the contract stipulating that an extension may be considered on a case-by-case basis. According to the complainant, the basis of her appeal for extension was based on the grounds that Ikaletemba had not provided services as per the signed contract. That was the first complaint. Secondly, we had another complainant that was admitted as a survivor of gender-based violence. She alleged that she was discriminated against by Ikaletemba due to her chronic health diagnosis in terms of language.
Right, you're watching the address of the Commission for Gender Equality investigative report on the state of shelters in South Africa. The investigation was prompted by the CGE's proposal for law reform in 2013. And you'll remember the Commission says that it also focused on its investigations on the accessibility and inclusiveness of shelters for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, asexual and other diverse sexual orientations and gender identity sector. And as we were talking about in terms of how the formula they used, several shelters in all 9 provinces were randomly sampled in an endeavor to get a clear state of affairs in these shelters in South Africa. And they used a multi-pronged approach, such as questionnaires, consultative meetings, and on-site observations to obtain this data. And the resultant investigative report detailed specific recommendations aimed at bettering the state and impact of shelters in a South African context. And one of the recommendations was this public investigative hearings that they call for, and they want various role players to come here to these hearings and account, and this will hopefully, they say, lead to further recommendations. And some of the issues that they found in terms of their report was funding, late payment, infrastructure and security issues, as well as standardized salaries. And they say these are deep-rooted systemic challenges that needs to be addressed at the highest level. So we'll have more on this report, the Commission for Gender Equality investigative report on the state of shelters in South Africa. We're going to take a quick break, get you more news next. Stay with us.